This episode is brought to you by Deal. Managing a global team is complex. Deal makes it simpler with payroll, HR, IT, and compliance, all in one place. That's why over 35,000 businesses trust Deal to hire, pay, and manage teams worldwide. See how Deal works at deal.com/Adrian Tan to learn more. That's DEEL.com/ADRIANTAN. Deal, your forever people platform. Hello, Su-Yen. Thank you for coming on to the show.
Hi, Adrian. Good to be here.
Where are you right now?
I am actually just finishing up an event in Singapore.
Okay, the same event that I was in earlier on when
Yes.
we met.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
so Su-Yen and I actually met earlier this morning. She was doing another event. It's a full day packed for
Same
her.
day, same day, different place.
Yes.
Now we're virtual.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming onto the show. So, for people who may not know you, how do you usually introduce yourself?
So I have a portfolio of things that I do. I am a board director. I am a professional speaker. I am also a leadership professor. So I think that probably encapsulates it in three chunks.
Yes, help us to understand some of your corporate journey, and then we can touch on what made you decide to go on your current path.
So if we go far back enough, I actually started out in a very non-corporate way. I actually started out studying music and actually was music and computer science. So I morphed from pure music to music and computer science. And then from there, moved into marketing. So I actually started my first professional job in marketing. Thing is, because I studied music, I didn't really know what I was doing. So I said, okay, let me go back to school and learn a little bit about what I'm actually doing. So that's when I actually went down into the strategy consulting path after I got my MBA. I thought I would go into consulting for 3 years, maybe 5, but ended up being a 23-year journey. So during that time, I was doing strategy consulting in the US. Then I moved to Thailand. I was in Korea. I was in Hong Kong. I was working across Asia Pacific. And after about 20 over years, finally came back to Singapore, where I then started moving to the human capital and leadership space. So all told, 23 years in consulting.
That's really a long time. When I first started my first business, I thought it was just play for 2 years, but 2 years ended up 12 years, and things just moved so And
That's
what
right.
actually motivated you to transition back then from your corporate leadership role to starting your own thing? What was the key factor behind that?
One of the things that I have always been very mindful of is that actually life or careers ought to be lived in chapters. And to me, it's always about doing something to be good at it. But once you get good at it, it's very easy to coast. And so for me, even within my consulting career, I actually moved from the strategy side to the human capital side. And when I could have continued on that path, but actually I wanted to make a switch. So in a sense, moving into the portfolio career was just another switch. So I actually first started asking myself the question of what's next about 15 years ago. So I was actually very happily in my corporate role with no plans to change that actually. But I was starting to think about and contemplate, well, what could be next? So this was probably around 2007, maybe, somewhere around that time frame. So, and because of that, one of the things that I was curious about, it was just a curiosity, was this notion of, as a consultant, you have to advise your clients. By the end of the day, it's up to the company to take action, right? The management has to take it forward. So I thought, well, perhaps if I, get the opportunity to serve on a board, I'll be closer to the company in terms of being able to direct strategy and see things through for the company. So I was curious about that. So that's why I first started looking into board roles at that time. But it wasn't about sort of finishing one chapter and then starting another. I actually did both in parallel for a very long time.
This is very similar to a lot of discussion I have with many other people, is to have things in parallel. Because if you don't do things in parallel, when you want to make the jump from A to B, you realize it's a huge struggle. You are going into a completely new game, and often you're playing the new game on hardest mode.
Whenever you move into something different, there is always a learning curve, no matter what it is, right? Whether you want to be a board director, whether you want to set up your own business, or whatever it is. So I think that time is one that really cannot be short-circuited. So, different strokes for different folks. You're right that I know some people who feel very uncomfortable moving in parallel. they want to finish one thing and then start looking at the other thing. It's still going to take the same number of years to get there in terms of the amount of time. The downside of going in parallel is that in those years when I was running in parallel, particularly when I was getting at sort of building momentum, it was very intense. So not gonna lie, very intense. So that's the trade-off that I think one has to be willing to make, which is you know that you're doing your full-time job, but you're also doing this thing on top of it. So, but you know, the upside, which I should also say for your listeners, is that then when you actually step back from one, the other thing is ready to go.
You truly, fully went self-employed probably 5 years?
About 5 years ago,
Yeah.
2018.
So during that time, was it just to build up the momentum to make sure that you can go full self-employed or full independent much comfortably? Or was there something still held you back during that period of time?
I never actually had a specific time horizon of when I'm going to pull the trigger. It wasn't like I'm going to do this for 10 years and after 10 years I'm going to move into something else. That wasn't it at all. It was more about I want to learn. And at that time I was really focusing on learning how to be a board director. So I was learning about governance and all those kind of things. So learning and just, I said at some point I will likely make a switch. I just didn't know when that was. The trigger for when that happened was actually when my dad was very ill. So my dad was very sick. We had stage 4 cancer. And the doctors basically say, well, you know, he has a few months to go. And you kind of go, well, what's months? They say, well, we have no idea. Could be 2 months, could be 9 months. Nobody knows. But because I actually had built up a very strong foundation, I was literally able to make that decision that I was going to leave my corporate role and step back from that literally in a weekend, right? And so I think there are, I didn't know when I would actually make that decision, but that time did come. And then I was able to make the decision very easily.
That's because you really started all this prep work years ago, which helped you to make your later decision much easier. Now, touching very much on this board directorship thing, I think for many people, they still see it from a very mystical lens. How does one even get into it? It seems like it's a old gentleman club kind of stuff. Could you elaborate a bit more on your personal journey when you first started?
Yeah.
Because I would imagine it was probably a lot harder back in 2007 when you decided to get into it. What were some of the frictions, some of the things that you've seen back then, and how does it differ from currently?
It's a great question. Well, I don't play golf. So the stereotype, play golf and all that. So I don't do that. I don't drink very much, so it's not that either. One of the things that I was mindful of was that actually moving into a board role will require that one gains experience. But it's a little bit like getting your first job after you graduate from university. Nobody wants to hire you once you have experience. How do you get experience and nobody wants to hire you, right? It's exactly the same thing for board roles. So one of the things that I did was actually, first of all, sign up for a bit of training so that I actually had a better foundation for what do I need to know. Because I was very mindful that at least I was aware that it was different from being in a management role. So step 1. Step 2, then I actually started making some plans in terms of building networks. So I joined SID, the Singapore Board of Directors. I actually then also started to put my name out onto board listing services to see whether there might be a match. But here's that I think is a little bit unconventional from what many people do. I mentioned a minute ago that it's very hard to get your first job or your first board role. However, I actually turned down my first couple of roles because I didn't think there was a good fit. So I was quite mindful about finding the right opportunity to learn from. Because I think it's like any other job or any other role. If you work with great people, you will learn a lot. If you find something just because it is a job or just because it's a board role, yeah, sure, I might be able to check that box sooner, but I might not have had the same foundation in terms of learning, right? So it took me a while. It took me a few years, actually, from the time I first started thinking about it to when I actually landed my first board role. And I think this is pretty common for most people. Difficult in terms of, it's, as I mentioned earlier, when you don't experience with, everybody sort of say, well, I want somebody who's experienced, right? So in the end, it does depend on, I think, having some baseline knowledge. I think that makes a big difference. Because a lot of people have this abstract view of they want to do something, whether it's a board role or something else, but how do you show that you're actually committed? So I think that's one element. And then, in all honesty, somebody has to take a gamble on you. They have to believe, based on what they're seeing and your track record, that you can do the job. It's the same as getting your first job at university, right? Somebody has to believe that you can do it. Give it a shot, and then from there you go. Then you
So in hindsight, if you know how to golf and you love drinking, would that have made things much easier?
Actually, I don't think so. Actually, to be honest, I think that nowadays, at least today, boards are getting a bit more sophisticated in terms of really focusing on what do you need, what does the organization need, and then how do you actually go and find the right people who meet those needs. I think, having said that, there are all kinds of boards. There are some boards where probably, if you know how to golf, it might be an asset in some way. But I think, like anything else, it's about finding the right fit. Those are probably not the right boards for me. Maybe it's the right board for somebody else, but it's not right for me. It's a bit like choosing a spouse, I sort of say. There's somebody who's great, right? But may not be the right person for you, right? So you have to find the right fit. Same thing, right? So it doesn't mean the person is a bad person. It just means that it's not the right fit for me. So I think it's the same with the board. Yeah, I there are still some boards, candidly, that are still strictly based on who you know. But I think the more progressive boards are very much focused on a much more objective process about how they find the right people for that board.
What's your first board role then, and how did that actually come about?
My first board role was actually the National Kidney Foundation, NKF. Now, at the time, if you remember back to sort of the late 2000s, it wasn't too long after the whole scandal around, gold taps and all this sort of thing, which people still, unfortunately, still remember. And so I actually had to think a little bit about, is this the right board for me to start with? Because it's going to be difficult, right? Whenever you have a challenging situation that you want to go into and make it better, it's always going to be difficult. Having said that, I was very comforted by the structure of the new board that was in place, the new chair that was in place, and the focus really on making things better. So in a funny way, that has kind of characterized the way I think about boards, which is I tend to join boards where I think I can make a difference, even though it may not be a straightforward situation. It may be a little bit controversial. It might be challenging, whatever the reason. So back to my point, the first decision on which board you get onto, I think was important for me because that helped shape the way I think about the role. So in hindsight, it was absolutely the right decision for me, even though it was a tough assignment.
And tough assignments seems to follow you around. For people who may find Susan's name familiar because she was, of course, mentioned in the press due to the recent CDL news. I'd like to also perhaps touch a bit about the kind of, I wouldn't say risk factor, but perhaps both sides of the coin when it comes to sitting on board. Because for someone like me who may not be that familiar, you tend to see things from a rose-tinted glass. That, board directorship is so nice. You just go in once a quarter, eat buffet, just decide, make some decision and that's it. But there's actually a lot more to that. So perhaps you can help us understand a bit more about the key responsibility, I think that importantly, the fiduciary duties of a board and what are some of the risk factors that it comes with.
As a board director, you're responsible for the organization as a whole and for all its stakeholders, which includes shareholders, customers, employees, the whole gamut, regulators, and so forth. And so when you think about risks in an organization, there can be all sorts of risks. At one level, you have strategic risks. And so it could be because interest rates are increasing, or because you've got tariffs that are being imposed, or maybe your technology is obsolete. So all of these kinds of issues are risks that one needs to think about. Geopolitical, strategic, technological, human capital risk, financial risk, very, very holistic. Those are the risks that come with the business itself. And then, of course, you have risks that have to do with the risk of being on a particular board, because the board is the ultimate decision maker, ultimate driver for an organization. And this is true actually, whether it's a listed company or a non-profit organization or a startup, any kind of organization that has a board, it's the board that has accountability for it. So this is the part about making sure that you're able to make decisions that are in the best interests of its stakeholders. So one needs to therefore have two qualities that I think of. One is expertise. So I started out earlier by saying one of the first things I did was I wanted to get educated, right? What do I need to know about this governance and what governance entails? But then next element is what you need to know about the business so that you can actually help the business. So expertise, do you have the right expertise? The second dimension, which I think is also just as important, is I think I would call it moral courage. How do you, as an independent director, make the right decisions for the organization? I often say, if you have a decision that is between good and bad, right and wrong, actually the decision is not so easy. Most of us, it's not so difficult. Most of us will go with what's good and what's right? Quite obvious. But sometimes in a situation, let's say you're trying to make an investment decision, and there are trade-offs you have to make. You are forced to actually choose between two good decisions or two not so good decisions, right? So the ability to make those kinds of calls and to really have that clarity of thinking, and I think the courage and the judgment is right. Because on a board is a team, individuals, and with a team, there are always team dynamics. So if you are somebody that is not willing to, number one, have a point of view, and then number two, state that point of view, then are you able to actually discharge your duties? I think it's a question that is very important to ask. Again, we all have different personalities. Some people lean towards maybe taking a step back and maybe following the lead of somebody else. Some people are more comfortable being able to exercise more independence of judgment. I think the ability to be self-aware is really important to know whether the board director journey is a comfortable one or not, right? And that's irony in that statement right there, because you need to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Cliche, but true. Cliche, but true. Yeah.
Trying to find a board seat is very similar to finding a spouse. Maybe more so finding a job, not that different. Are there some red flags that you think you could share with our audience who might be new to this?
One of the things that I do look at is the business. Structurally, is the business in a good space? And if it's not in a good space, is there an opportunity to turn it around? I don't shy away from situations where maybe the business is going through some challenges and you can actually do things to make it better. That's fine. That's no problem. I'm very up for that. Actually, most of the time when I join a board, it's because it's going through some form of transformation. But if it is in a situation where it really doesn't seem to have any path forward to be salvageable, that for me is a red flag. Other things that I look at is whether you have transparency around the matters of the organization. As a board, you need to be able to discharge your duties, and in order to do that, you really need to understand what's going on in the company. I want to make sure that there's, if there's fraudulent behavior, you need to be able to address these issues, and you need to have your eyes wide open, I guess. Right? So I think it's a little bit the same as, back to the spouse example. You rather know about a particular situation and know that it can be addressed than not know, and then 6 months down the road you find out about it, or 12 months or 2 years down the road, right? So I think being able to understand with clarity what the situation is really critical to decision making.
Is there a physical limit to how many boards they should sit on that they could capably actually discharge their duty across? I'm reminded of a very old article, and maybe this is not applicable right now. I think it was some past minister who was sitting on 60 overboards. It was ridiculous. I mean, that sounds more than a full-time job. Is there a limit that you think would make better sense for one to be more responsible?
It's difficult to look at the numbers themselves. Now, I don't know what 60 boards were involved in the situation that you mentioned, and 60 certainly does sound fairly extreme. But let me give you an example. If you look at companies that have a lot of projects, very often instead of having all the projects done under one company, they'll set up individual companies and run projects through those individual companies. It's back to your point about risk. It's so that you can manage the risk within a particular entity. In that situation, it is entirely conceivable that a director who is a director of the company is actually a director of all these other sub-companies as well. But it's all part of the same company. It's just that structurally it's set up as individual companies. So I just want to put that out there, because sometimes when you read the headline, you kind of go, oh my God, that's such a large number. But you need to understand what kind of companies they are, right? So I think that's one. The second thing is also number of companies does not denote effort, because you might be on one company that is just, for whatever reason, going through a lot of changes, a lot of transformation, maybe a new CEO, whatever it is, and that actually might take up a lot of time. On the other hand, you might be of another organization where actually business is going well, management team is in place, you need to make sure that you have a good pulse, but it doesn't really, there's nothing out of the ordinary. It's quite business as usual. So one does not equal one, right? So that's the reason why I think in the Singapore context, the regulator hasn't put a hard number on the number of boards. Number one, it's an architecture of the company issue. But number two, also the situations do differ. I think at the end of the day, what's important is we have to know ourselves and whether we are able to discharge our duties and whether we have the capacity to do that. And that, again, is another individual decision. Because somebody might say, I'm at a particular stage in life where I really want to spend, X% of my time doing personal stuff. I want to travel, I want to take care of whatever it is I need to take care of. And I only have a certain capacity for professional related work. That is very different than somebody who basically says, actually, I'm really still going full steam ahead. It's just that my full steam ahead is portfolio constructed, right? And so therefore, your hours and your capacity actually look very, very different in those situations.
It really depends on your personal capacity. If you already have a full-time job, if you're a high-flying CEO, maybe you want to lay low on the number of boards. But if you are already maybe semi-retired, fully retired, just an adjunct professor at a university, then that will be a very different answer altogether.
Exactly.
Besides, of course, just sitting on boards, you're also a speaker and you do many other things. What inspired you to go into those other fields? Because they're not exactly adjacent.
I've always been somebody who has enjoyed having a breadth of things that I get involved in. So, I'm that person where in university I'm in Club A and Club B and Club C. so quite fragmented. So, and it's because I suppose in my situation, what I find actually to be one of my quote-unquote superpowers is the ability to cross adjacent areas and actually to help connect the dots. Because you're absolutely right that some of these aspects on the face value don't seem to have much relation. And in fact, one of the things that I do need to be very careful about is how I manage the interrelationships in terms even of how I am viewed, right? In the market, because I'm doing a number of different things. However, for me, the ability to think about lessons in leadership is very linked actually into how you think about leadership in a boardroom, because it's leadership just at a different level and decision making just a different level. And in fact, I think that helps me become a better speaker or better professor, because I've been able to see how decisions are made at that kind of a level. I think I've been able to make it make sense for me anyway. But I will say that this means that I am actually fairly selective within each of those domains about what I choose to take on. I can't say yes to everything. There's no way. Because if you're broad, that means that within each of those subsegments, I got to say, okay, I'll only take on this type of speaking engagement, or this kind of class that I'm going to teach, or this kind of work I'm going to take on. Because I need to manage it across my portfolio, right? So, that's how I try to balance the different elements.
I think it's Professor Scott Galloway, as well as Professor Cal Newport, that mentioned this as well. Don't pursue your passion, pursue your talent. So to your point about knowing what your superpower is and try to double down in that area, I think that really makes a lot of sense. For people who may be many steps before you, How did you even cover what your superpowers are?
This unfolds over time. And at least for me, it has also changed over time. I mean, not surprisingly, I think early on in one's career, it's really important to be good at the technical delivery of whatever that thing might be. So when I started out in consulting, it was being able to be very good strategically, very good at thinking about how you design strategies, understand your organization context, and so forth. But then over time, what I've come to appreciate, and this is true not just for me, it's true for anyone in a leadership role, is that the answer itself gets you to a certain point. If you have the right answer, but nobody believes that you have the right answer, you're not able to convince other people or explain why it is the right answer, you haven't moved the needle, is it, right? So therefore, I have found that over time, I layered on, I think, another skill, I would say, which is the ability to listen, to synthesize, to connect the dots, and to try to influence and drive to consensus. As it turns out, that skill and that level of experience is exactly what needs to happen in a boardroom, because in a boardroom, you are amongst peers. So it's not like, oh, I'm the boss and there are people who have to do what I say. Not at all, right? It's all through power of persuasion and influence and being able to articulate your rationale and reasoning for whatever the situation might be. So over time, I think I have built different types of superpowers, but I've also come to appreciate the value of different types of superpowers over time. And so I think it's an evolving mix. And, I would hope that in the next 10 years or the next 20 years, that keeps evolving for me as well. It's just that I can't see it right now. But I think if you sort of start to layer on and go deep, eventually the pattern becomes clear.
You just have to try new things constantly without huge expectation on yourself what it would lead to, because as Steve Jobs famously said, you can only connect the dots looking backwards. Yeah, but if you don't try, then you have no dots to connect to.
You have no dots. Exactly. And I think also that it's this fine balance between trying and experimenting. But at the same time, if you only experiment and you don't get to surface level, that doesn't quite cut it either, right? So it's a mix of trying different things, but then at some point then going deep into those areas where you find some resonance. But like you said, if you don't try it, you don't know, right? So if I had never thought about experimenting or exploring the board path, I would never have gone past that first one. And truth be told, the first board the first time I went onto a board, not at all convinced that this was something that might be for me. I was very agnostic about it. I said, I'm going to try it, I'm going to learn, and I'll make a decision at some point, somewhere down the process, whether it's the appropriate thing or not. And I was perfectly comfortable if the answer was no, this is not right for you. Right? So I think it's just important to know what to walk away from.
In one of my earlier episodes, my guest was asked a similar question, and his answer is try 3 times. At least try 3 times. Because by the third time, if you try and you still don't like it, or you feel something is off, then it's likely
why is
not
the fourth
for
time going to be different?
Yeah, why the fourth time is going to be different, right?
By the same token, though, if you only try once, it might be circumstances that lead to it not being a good experience. Nothing to do with you.
Exactly.
It might be this particular situation. So that's good advice. 3 times. Okay,
Yeah.
I remember that.
This morning we met because you were running should I call it a workshop or maybe more of a discussion?
Yep.
And this is related to a new term that I've learned, Encore Career.
Encore careers.
Encore Career.
Yes.
Which of course is also known as Portfolio Career. There's a lot of different terms.
Lots of different terms, yes.
And of course, you also have your own community of people who are also pursuing self-employment. So you're really quite in the deep of things related to this self-employment scene. So I want to understand.
Well, as are you. You wrote a whole book on it.
Yeah, but this is my show.
Yes.
So it's more on you today.
Yes.
So I'd like to understand through your lens, what do you see as the biggest advantages and challenges of being self-employed?
I'll start with the downside. I think it can be very lonely. For somebody who is used to being in a corporate setup, number one, you have lots of infrastructure. So you have a lot of people who do stuff so that make the whole organization work. You have a lot of people that are peers, that are on your team, that you work with together. And for some people, that's very important. And when they move into more of a solopreneur or a self-employment stage, they find that number one, they have no infrastructure. So they have to do everything. Everything from accounting to marketing to everything, right? To the delivery, to the sales, right? So challenging on that front. But second, it's a little bit lonely. Who do you bounce ideas around with, right? So I think those are some of the elements that people sometimes find challenging, which, back to the point that you raised earlier, is one of the reasons why I actually established my community for people who want to reinvent and move into the space, so that they can have a peer group to actually address these kind of issues, which previously they might have been able to address in a larger organization construct. Okay, having said that, what are the upsides, right? I would say that it's immensely empowering to be able to have agency over one's time. I think, I believe that, easier said than done, but if we want to make more money, we can make more money. But if we want to make more time, that's very difficult. Time is the one thing that is actually very finite, right? We all have 24 hours in the day. I can't make more, right? It's just 24. So how do we want to spend that time? And how do we then choose how we want to deploy that time? That's something that I think, when we're on our own, we have the agency to do so. It needs discipline and everything else, because of course you may allocate your portfolio of time in a way that's very risky, back to risk, or you may allocate it in a way that's more balanced. All of these, I think, are quite important concepts for somebody who's interested in moving into the space.
I personally was in one of the events that you organized with part of your community, and it was great, really think of ideas. I think most importantly, knowing there are people going down this path with you. If I imagine myself serving my NS alone, I think I'll die. But having fellow mates with me going through the hardship, that really make things very different. I think it's an African proverb. If you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, then you got to walk together.
Yeah. One of the things that some of the members of the community talk about most often is that it's so good to be with people who are going through this journey together. Because some of them, for example, are still in corporate roles. But to the point that we were talking about earlier about, doing things in parallel, is very hard, as you can imagine, to have those kind of conversations with your colleagues at work. Because, they're going to say, oh, is this person committed to their job? Are they going to quit? Are they, whatever? Are they being responsible? Whatever, anything you can imagine. So you're certainly not going to have those conversations with your boss. You're certainly not going to be having those conversations even with your peers, definitely not with subordinates. So your workspace doesn't really work. Then do you have conversations with your partner? Well, it depends. Sometimes our partners and spouses are the ones who actually want us to continue doing what we're doing. Why do you want to give that up and do something so risky, So sometimes it's a little awkward to have those conversations either. Although I do recommend that you do have those conversations. But maybe you need a sounding board with people who can say, well, maybe you want to phrase it that way instead, for example, right? So having a neutral community of people that are going through the same thing, but at different stages. So some further along, some lesser along, actually is an immense source of learning. At least that's what I'm told by some of the members. So I think it's a good thing to find your tribe.
I'm reminded of a recent meme that I saw online. Hashtag, we listen and we don't judge. And I think that's so important for you to find people who will listen to you but don't judge what you're trying to do, because every one of us has different starting point and every one of us have very different support system. But I think the end goal for all of us is we want to find what I guess would keep us energized, what will keep us happy, and to maintain that as long as possible. And on that, who are perhaps on the fence or planning self-employment, do not know where to start, besides the obvious of joining your community, and of course you mentioned about having that support system, what are some of the other stuff that you think you would advise them to prepare for, get ready, put it on standby before they decide to go all in?
To me, it's about building a foundation, building skills, which is sort of, and I'm just sharing my experience. Other people will have other experiences, obviously. And for me, it was about having that runway to learn so that when the time came that a decision had to be made in my case, or a choice you want to make, you are ready for it, right? So I would say start small. When you're, in an executive role, if you're able to do something that helps to build your skill in whatever this new space might be, just start. You don't have the pressure of time. Like I said, for me, it was 10 years, right? And just basically gradually getting better at it, building up my portfolio, building up my experience set. And one of the things that I often say is that when your hobby starts to take over your life, that's when you know that you're actually ready to switch, right? That hobby meaning, hey, whatever this other thing is that you're working on, right? So it gives you the at the very practical, for example, let's say you want to open a store so that you have clientele, right? Once you have a track record that you're working with clients, you have revenue coming in, your P&L more or less works. Okay, then you know that that you've tested the concept and you can tweak it with much less risk actually than if you sort of step off the cliff and now need to make certain decisions. And I find that people who do that are much more risk averse. Understandably, right? Understandably so. So my advice would be it's never too early to start and start getting some exposure, getting some experience. It doesn't even have to be remunerated. My first board was a pro bono board because it was a charity board, but my objective wasn't an income objective. My objective was a learning and experience objective, right? So I think that's a way that may be helpful for people to think about as they're contemplating their portfolio or a next chapter, however you define it.
You just have to pay your due in some sense. And to your also earlier point, it took you 10 years. It might be shorter for most people, it might be longer, nobody knows, but it is good to have those side hustles or side quests started as soon as you think you are capable of managing them, because you never know when those skill sets or those learnings might be activated. Especially in today's world, during the event earlier today, someone was talking about nowadays you have company announcing, we made record profit this quarter and proceed to lay off 1,000 people. So there's no logic in this world anymore. And I think it's much more important to realize that and to really be aware that there's no more iron rice bowl. It doesn't exist anywhere anymore. It's only you got to take care of yourself. And to take care of yourself in today's world, you got to have a lot of different things. And the earlier you start those side quests, the better.
A lot of organization practices are still quite rooted in the 1990s or 2000s, right? So from a sort of a generation ago. For example, if you look at a typical employee, it'll have things like your lunch hour is from 12 to 1, for example. Or it will say that your working hours are from 9 to 5, and then it'll say, and you're not allowed to take on any external roles, for example. So our employment constructs are quite outdated. Whereas nowadays, of course, and certainly the pandemic accelerated this point, it's not 9 to 5. It is, I'm talking particularly about knowledge workers, right? If you're in a knowledge workspace, it's whenever makes sense, right? And whether you're working with a client or for team members or whatever it is, it may not be 9 to 5, it might be 9 to 12 and then 3 to 7 or, something different. And I think the same is true in terms of encouraging employees to have other things other than their day job. Of course, you need to make sure it doesn't conflict, that the person isn't working for a competitor on the side. Okay, all those kind of safeguards you need to have in place. But as a society, even if somebody sort of says, I'm going to go down this particular path, the job is going to change. The organization is going to change. So you need people to be prepared. So you can't have large swaths of population that are not prepared for whatever that next thing is. To your point, record profits, but laying off because maybe we have AI or technology or something coming on board. Nothing wrong. Company needs to be able to do that. But I think that companies do have some responsibility to their people to help them get prepared for whatever it is. Minimally, not restricting them from learning and gaining other experiences. If you want to be a little bit more progressive, you actually encourage them.
I was speaking with another solopreneur a few days ago, and she just started her journey in executive coaching, and she's like all over the place because she realized she has to do her own prospecting, she has to do her own admin,
Everything.
bookkeeping, as you mentioned
Yes.
earlier on. You have so many things going on. You have your community, you have your speaking engagement, you have your board. How do you manage your time, and what advice do you have for people who are struggling to manage their time?
I think as a solopreneur, it's very tempting to want to do everything on your own because at some level that means that you earn more. And I have a lot of empathy for when somebody is starting out, because when you're starting out from zero means you walked away from your monthly paycheck, right? And what you need to count on is the ability to sell and bring in revenue, basically. You're sort of thinking, oh my goodness, how can I really afford to bring on team members, right? So I very much appreciate that logic. However, when the business gets to a certain point, and that comfort level is different for everybody, when it gets to a certain point, I believe it's really important to actually work with people that can support us in the work that we do. Because back to the point that I was making earlier, we cannot manufacture more time. We only have 24 hours in a day, which means that at some point that becomes the limiting factor. So what I'm doing is I'm basically trading money for time, right? And actually in doing so, I'm able to then spend time doing things that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. Otherwise, there's no way that I could cut across the number of things that I do. So I'll give you an example. When I teach, I make sure that I have really, really good teaching assistants. In an organization, I work with somebody who's outstanding and able to support, and over time has grown with the business and learned a lot about how to do the things that we need to do. My speaking work, clients may contact me directly, but I invariably actually hand the opportunities off to various speaker bureaus that I work with as well. So again, you may say, well, why do you do that? Because when you work with speaker bureau, you actually you pay them for that, right? So why is it client comes to me, but I still want to pay somebody else for that? It's because that actually allows me to scale, so to speak, right? It allows me to do other things that otherwise wouldn't have been able to do.
I know a lot of self-employed people are also tapping on virtual PA in order to manage their time, manage their busy schedule, because there's really a lot of things going on. And like you said, you only have 24 hours a day. You still need to eat, you still need to sleep, you still need to enjoy yourself. There's only so much time. But of course, I think it also depends on the phase of your life. If you're early on, of course, you have to bootstrap and do certain things. But towards the end, I think it's important for you to tap on those resources. So right now, one of my key fractional assignment, for the longest time, I also keep telling them, please don't let me manage people. I cannot manage my own kids. I don't want to manage other people's kids. But then when the resource came in, I'm like, this feels good. I can actually focus on certain stuff rather than just admin work, more Excel sheets and stuff. So even for me, I'm starting to see the benefit and the merits of having someone to help you out.
It really has to do with sort of, like you said, where we are at what stage as well, and how complex the different things are that we're working. I know some people where the work that they do, in terms of quote unquote the back end, it's not that complex. In which case they sort of say, well, does it really make sense to bring somebody on? Maybe not necessarily. Fine, no problem. But if you get to a certain stage where the things that you're doing are more complicated, and in fact, by hiring somebody or taking on somebody fractionally even, maybe you can take on 5 projects instead of 3 projects, right? So, I think it's a trade-off, and I want to do the mental calculation. But of course, managing people also takes time, right? So, so then I come back to the point about actually it's really important to have the ability to hire well.
Yep.
Actually, hiring is not easy, as you would know from your previous background as well. It's hard to make decisions on people, right?
Yeah.
So hiring well, I think, is an important skill set.
There will definitely be some sting along the way, some bumbling in the dark along the way. But ultimately, I think the bigger picture, you need the support in order to maximize what you can deliver so that you can focus on your superpower, because your superpower is on speaking, your superpower is on marketing, your superpower is not on bookkeeping. So drop that. Don't waste time on trying to struggle with trying to balance the book. You can never balance the book. Just give up and outsource it to someone. For people who are keen to learn more about what you do, where can they find you? Where can they go to? Where can they connect with you?
The best place would probably be my LinkedIn. or my website, www.suyenwong.com. And for those who are curious, I'm actually running a workshop at the end of this month about reinvention. And what's interesting about this, which might be curious to some of your listeners, is I'm actually featuring people who have reinvented themselves and are in their 70s and 80s and still super active. So this is something that I personally find very interesting. I'm obviously not 70 or 80, but I think that, what is fascinating to me is that it's very easy, I think, for many people to kind of go, oh, I'm quote unquote retired now, so I'm going to step back, fade off, whatever it is. But what is the amazing thing about these 5 individuals is that they are so full of energy. They have found ways to engage and re-engage themselves that when I was trying to invite them to join, this is one thing, more often than not, they would say, what's the date? I can't better check. Oh, I'm traveling on this date. I'm speaking at this date. I have to go to court this date. So I'm a lawyer. So my schedule is very busy. So I think it's fantastic for them to be so full of vitality and energy, and to be able to be contributing, engaged. And you know what? When you meet any of these 5, they seem so much younger than what they actually are. And I think there's a relationship there. The more engaged one is, the more it fuels us and it helps keep us alive, right? So anyway, so March 28th, Voices of Reinvention. And they can find that on bronzephoenix.com.
I'm just curious how you even managed to find 5 unique individuals in the 70s and 80s, because I would just imagine me going around, are you 70 years old? How old are you? Not exactly the right thing to do, but more on that for people who are keen to learn more. All this will be in the show notes. You can find out more and possibly even see you there at the event. But otherwise,
Awesome.
Su-Yen, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you, Adrian. Always a pleasure.